After the Robert Mueller investigation ended, and it became apparent that there was no evidence supporting the Russiagate conspiracy theory, the New York Times decided it needed to launch a new propaganda campaign against Donald Trump. The New York Times decided that because Donald Trump describes himself as an American nationalist, the New York Times decided that the best way to get Trump would be to rewrite American history so that America would now be viewed as a complete piece of shit country. Hello everyone. I've got two things to talk about today. The first is how Andrew Yang has established himself as a hero of American democracy. Secondly, the New York Times has won a Pulitzer Prize for falsely reporting on the history of the United States. The state of New York, under the urging of Governor Andrew Cuomo, decided it was going to cancel the Democratic primary election. It's abundantly clear at this point that Joe Biden is going to receive the majority of delegates necessary for him to be the nominee. At this point, there is no electoral way forward for any of the other candidates. Citing the coronavirus, New York officials canceled the primary election. However, despite there no longer being an electoral path towards victory, the primary elections are still an important part of the democratic process. This is especially true given the extreme weaknesses of Joe Biden as a candidate. First of all, time and time again, Joe Biden has shown himself to be mentally unfit to be president. Joe Biden has a long history of dishonesty, which includes forging law school transcripts to make it appear that he did well in school, when in fact the opposite was true. It's alleged at this point that Joe Biden groped one of his interns in the early 90s, as well as the fact that he told a 14-year-old girl that she had nice boobs. If the Democratic Party moves to axe Joe Biden, then all of those delegates that the other people who were running for president have suddenly matter. They would allow these candidates to make alliances, to demand concessions, to have some sort of say in who's going to be the candidate to replace Joe Biden. Obviously, the other candidate with the most number of delegates is Bernie Sanders. As discussed previously on this YouTube channel, Bernie Sanders is a loser. He lost on purpose. And prior to him dropping out, Bernie Sanders did not seek out a single concession from Joe Biden. In exchange for dropping out, Bernie Sanders could have leveraged his endorsement in order to get something for his base. But Bernie Sanders didn't get anything because Bernie Sanders is a loser and he doesn't care. So when the state of New York cancels the presidential primary, unsurprisingly, Bernie Sanders does nothing. He complains about it on Twitter, and that's about it. That is until a true American hero, none other than Andrew Yang, steps up to the plate and hits a home run. Andrew Yang sued the government of New York and got a federal court to reinstate the Democratic presidential primary election. Now, Andrew Yang has 0 delegates. He's unlikely to pick up any additional delegates in New York, which means he personally stands to gain nothing from this New York presidential primary being reinstated. Unless he can pick up a delegate, which is unlikely, Andrew Yang will have 0 say in anything that happens with the Democratic primary, even if they move to remove Joe Biden. So why would Andrew Yang then spend money suing the state of New York to reinstate the presidential primary? The only reason I can think of is that he's a patriot, that he did this as a matter of principle. He thinks democracy is important and is worth fighting for. So he filed this lawsuit and he won. And he got the Democratic presidential primary reinstated in New York. He did exactly what Bernie Sanders has been unwilling to do this whole time: fight the corruption that exists in the Democratic Party. I think Democrats made a giant mistake in not taking Andrew Yang's political campaign more seriously. And I say that as someone who has major reservations about a universal basic income. I think Andrew Yang's proposed UBI would be far superior to our current welfare state, which traps people in poverty. By far the best part of the UBI is it doesn't de-incentivize people from making more money or bettering themselves, unlike our current welfare state. But like all libertarian policies, I believe that UBI is only going to work successfully if it's paired with a culture of personal responsibility and virtue. In our deeply irresponsible contemporary society, I don't think people will use the UBI payments responsibly. I think a lot of people will quit their jobs and try and live off of the payment. Now, even if that's true, once again, I think it would be a vast improvement over our current welfare state. UBI would make things better in this country, not worse, assuming that it supplanted the welfare state. However, in my view, it's not the ideal solution for a society and culture like the United States. Now, if American culture were to shift, if, for example, we became more like 1950s era America, then I would agree that universal basic income would probably be the best sort of social welfare program that could be instituted. That's because libertarian policies tend to pair very well with cultures that emphasize personal responsibility. That's why I've said that I don't oppose, in principle, the legalization of certain illegal drugs. I think that you can have a society where drugs like crystal methamphetamine, marijuana, or cocaine are legal without it causing massive social problems. However, for this to be the case, the culture of that society needs to emphasize a certain amount of personal responsibility. And our contemporary culture lacks that virtue of responsibility. In the 1950s, drugs including marijuana and methamphetamine were legal. These drugs were used recreationally without tons of people becoming addicted to them. This is because people were more responsible and there were a host of social institutions looking out for the welfare of individual Americans. Nowadays, people are isolated from each other. But going back to Andrew Yang, even if he was unsuccessful at instituting UBI as president, I still think there's a lot of reasons to believe that he would have been a great president. His political campaign had a lot of well thought out political proposals on a variety of problems facing the United States. I could definitely see an Andrew Yang presidential administration doing things like enforcing the antitrust laws that haven't been enforced since Ronald Reagan was president. I could see an Andrew Yang presidency fighting political corruption. I could see an Andrew Yang administration trying to bring back more manufacturing to the United States. I do not see a Joe Biden presidency doing any of those things. It's hard to imagine that Joe Biden would do anything other than perpetuate the same failed neoliberal politics that we've had for decades. I think the Democratic voters made a big mistake by supporting candidates like Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders over someone like Andrew Yang. Andrew Yang's willingness to step up to the plate and fight the Democratic leadership to preserve what little remains of a democratic process in the Democratic primary shows that he would have been a far superior candidate than any of the other people who ran for president. Moving on, the New York Times has won a Pulitzer Prize for its 1619 Project. After the Robert Mueller investigation ended, and it became apparent that there was no evidence supporting the Russiagate conspiracy theory, the New York Times decided it needed to launch a new propaganda campaign against Donald Trump. The New York Times decided that because Donald Trump describes himself as an American nationalist, the New York Times decided that the best way to get Trump would be to rewrite American history so that America would now be viewed as a complete piece of shit country. So it created this 1619 Project basically to spread anti-American lies and propaganda. It did so not only through a series of news articles that appeared in the New York Times, but it also adopted the lies and propaganda of the 1619 Project into an educational curriculum that is currently being taught in many public schools in the United States. If you have children attending a public school in the United States, there's a good chance that they're learning these lies about American history. So what are these lies that are being spread? First of all, the 1619 Project teaches that racism is inherent in the DNA of white people. White people are genetically inferior to the other races, according to the 1619 Project, because they have a strand of DNA that makes them racist. No other races have this DNA. It's only white people. Likewise, because white people founded America, it's always been a deeply racist country. The entire reason that America declared its independence and fought the Revolutionary War, according to the 1619 Project, was to preserve the institution of slavery. The 1619 Project also indicates that the founding fathers were all deeply racist and that they were all primarily concerned with preserving the institution of slavery. Not long after the New York Times launched the 1619 Project, it got called out from pretty much all sides for being nothing but a bunch of woke bullshit. These complaints were not voiced only from the right, they also came about equally from the left. An early voice to criticize the project was the World Socialist Party. 5 world-renowned historians on American history joined together to condemn the project for being factually inaccurate. Far-left publications such as the website Counterpunch, a website that openly embraces identity politics with open arms, ran articles contesting the 1619 Project for being factually inaccurate. Given the response from both the left and the right, it would be fair for any neutral observer to come to the conclusion that the 1619 Project was nothing but a bunch of woke revisionist nonsense. There is no scientific study that confirms that white people have a certain strand of DNA that makes them racist. That's a complete lie and fabrication. Likewise, the institution of slavery did not come into practice in the United States because Americans were deeply racist. It is a myth and a lie that the whites in the United States enslaved black people. Those black people that were brought to the United States were already enslaved by other black people. The first set of black people brought to the United States were actually liberated by the white Americans. As Christians, these early white Americans could not abide by the fact that they owned these people as slaves. So even though they were purchased in Africa as slaves, the white Americans converted them to indentured servants. Because it was much more expensive to transport black workers to the United States than whites, because you had to take a boat around the Sahara Desert and stop on the west coast of Africa, the length of indentured servitude that these black workers had became significantly longer than whites. Over time, the period of servitude got longer and longer until American employers ended up dropping the pretension that these people were servants and began treating them once again as slaves. It's also a lie that the founding fathers were nothing but a bunch of racists who loved slavery. Do you think that people like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington were just massive idiots, that they couldn't see a contradiction when they were writing things like the Declaration of Independence or the Bill of Rights with how black slaves were treated in America? No, they weren't stupid. They realized that the founding ideas of America contradicted the institution of slavery. If George Washington had thought he had the ability to abolish the institution of slavery, he would have done so. The reason that he didn't is he had just fought a war of independence with Great Britain, a war that they had barely won with the support of the South, where slavery was a massive economic institution. If he had tried to abolish slavery, the early American government would have fallen apart and would have been reconquered by European powers like Great Britain or France. If George Washington was such a big racist and slavery supporter, then why did George Washington not only free all of his slaves upon his death, but establish a college fund so that the children of every person who had worked for a slave of him could get a college education? Does that sound like something a racist would do? Does that sound like something someone who supported slavery would do? There's also no evidence that the reason the United States declared independence and fought the Revolutionary War was to preserve the institution of slavery. The British Empire did not make attempts to eliminate slavery until it passed the Slavery Abolition Act in 1833. That is almost 60 years after the United States achieved its independence from Great Britain. The Founding Fathers wrote a ton of shit. They wrote books. They wrote all these Federalist Papers. They wrote a Declaration of Independence laying out all of their grievances with the British government. You know what doesn't exist in any of these things written by the Founding Fathers? Grievances with the British government about the institution of slavery in the United States. If this was the key reason why independence was declared from Great Britain, why is it not mentioned in any of these documents? Why isn't it in the Declaration of Independence? Why isn't it in the Federalist Papers? If slavery was so important to the Founding Fathers, why did they not protect the institution of slavery in the U.S. Constitution? In fact, the U.S. Constitution does not mention the institution of slavery. The closest it comes is when it discusses the apportionment of representatives. It indicates that a person other than a free person shall be counted as 3/5 of a person in determining congressional representatives. Now, the 1619 Project will tell you that the U.S. Constitution is racist. It treats black people as only 3/5 of a person, except that it doesn't. Nothing in this part of the Constitution talks about race. No distinction is drawn between black and white people. Instead, the division is between free people and people who aren't free. And guess what? A lot of the black people living in the United States at the time the Constitution was enacted were free black people. That means they were counted as one whole person. To say that the U.S. Constitution treats black people as 3/5 of a white person is a lie. The fact that the New York Times won a Pulitzer Prize for this propaganda campaign shows just how much the institution of journalism has decayed in this country. The fact that the so-called paper of record in our country can publish a series of propaganda articles full of easily contradicted lies and win the highest, most prestigious journalism award, the Pulitzer Prize, is deeply troubling. This is something that you would expect to see in a totalitarian country, someplace like the Soviet Union. This is yet another piece of evidence of America's decline into some sort of dystopian nightmare type of society. But anyways, that's all I've got to say for today. If you like this video and you're not subscribed to my YouTube channel, please subscribe.